What are you doing here? You do realize that this video is about testing, like automated testing. And you don't need to write tests because as developers, we don't write bugs. Isn't that correct? Same with security. We pay all that money for ORMs and frameworks so they can take care of security for us. Same with accessibility, performance, and caching. As a developer, I want to focus on all the fun stuff, animations and rounded corners, right? That's the video. Thank you and good night. All jokes aside, all the tools that I mentioned in this video are open source. So before we get started, let me know in the comments below who writes automated tests, who writes them on a regular basis, I mean weekly. And there's a reason why I'm asking that question, because at the end I'm going to ask another question and it's kind of related. I want to see if your point of view changes. So the important question, why is automated testing important? Well, let's take a login, for example. Like most apps have login. And if you're doing it manually, you're probably going to test, does the login work? But what about testing it doesn't work? Do you get the email wrong and check that you can't log in? Do you get the password wrong and check that you can't log in? Usually for each happy path, logging in successfully, there are many unhappy paths, which is that you can't log in. That's correct, but we want to check that. But there are so many different scenarios to check. There is the correct credentials, there is the incorrect credentials. But what about wrong e-password? What about wrong email and different combinations? What about secure pages to check that a guest can't manipulate the URL and get to that location? Where are they redirected to when that happens? What about when they log in? Where are they redirected to after that? And there are so many pages. You can't check all of these pages every time you make a change. So you want to be able to confidently make a change and check that you haven't broken anything. And you probably don't want to test every single combination each time you make a change. And as your app grows, so will the tests. Let's take, for example, 10 features. If you have 10 features, you're not going to have 10 tests. You're going to have 50 to 100 tests. That's a lot. This is manual and it's slow. It's error prone if you're doing it manually. How can you be sure you don't miss one or get something wrong and give yourself a false sense of security? What if you could automate this and run like 1,000, 10,000 tests while you make a coffee? Well, one, it's going to save you time. Two, there's less mistakes. Three, you're going to have a higher quality product. Four, it's repeatable, so you can do it every time you make a change. And guess what? These tests can be reviewed. So the tests are at a higher quality and we get that, knowledge transfer goodness from pull requests. And you can do this pretty easily with automated testing. It is not magic and it is not difficult. There are many tools that can help us do this. I love this scenario. You get a bug, because we get bugs in our apps. You can then write an automated test, which will fail. And then you can fix the bug and the test will now pass. And guess what? That bug will never appear again. That is awesome, right? Why would no one want this? Everyone should want this. This is nothing new. I've been doing this since the beginning of my coding career for 15 years. Now I'm showing you my age, but maybe to give you a bit more perspective, I started with open source before there was Git and GitHub. Shh, that'll be our secret. Here's a question for all of you. If this is so great, why aren't we all doing it? Please put a comment below and let me know what you think. I'll wait. Don't worry. I'll wait for you to write that comment. I am so curious to know if it is so great, if automated testing will save us so much time in the long run, why aren't we all doing it? Have you written your comment? Okay, let me share some of my thoughts or some of the things that I've seen. Some people say it takes too much time. Some people say, well, I have to learn something new. I've heard others say it's going to slow us down. I've even heard people say, well, it's difficult to maintain as tests become out of date. And I've heard this one. This is an interesting one. CI, so continuous integration, will take longer to build. Therefore, it will delay our deployment. So the whole process is slower. And this one's a gem. I'm not a tester. Tests are written by testers. I wonder if any of you wrote that below. I'll be curious to check it out. I actually think it's because we don't celebrate quality. Pull requests with documentation and tests are not rewarded like a great design. Like you don't hear someone say, wow, that's a great test. Well, I might say that, but generally speaking, people don't reward that. Or they don't say, oh, great, your pull request contains the changes to the project, documentation, and tests. They don't, but they will say, wow, that's great design. Wow, that's a great animation. And I think that's one of the major reasons why. So we should celebrate quality. Also, there are unrealistic deadlines from, the team, project managers, the powers that be. Plus, we are terrible. Developers are terrible at estimating how long something will take. Maybe because we don't include the tests and the documentation, or we don't have testing in the first place, so we change a little bit of code over here and something else breaks over there. Testing is super important. But there are some challenges with writing testing. Third-party server-side API requests are really difficult to kind of test. They are a problem. Also, authentication is a problem. I've seen some horrible workarounds, let's say. Don't tell anyone I said this, and please never do this. I've seen big projects that the companies have at the end of the URL, $superadmin equals true. And that's so the test can run as an admin. That just seems terribly, terribly wrong and a recipe for disaster. Maybe they don't deploy it to production, but I bet you one day it will get deployed and someone will discover it. There are proper ways to do this to make testing easy for you, and you don't have to cut any corners or risk your project. In fact, it's going to make your project more secure because you can run automated testing with security checks, accessibility checks, performance checks, and so much more. You can build on that foundation. I believe a good pull request should contain the project changes, documentation changes, and tests, and we should celebrate quality. If you agree, give the video a thumbs up. If you don't, still give the video a thumbs up. It really helps. I appreciate it. Another reason I often hear, and I hear this a lot, and I'm pretty sure I've said it myself over the years, is, but in the time it takes me to write the tests, I can add one more feature. Yes, the project manager will say, great work. The users will say, great work. Client will say, great work. But more features doesn't mean better. As a user of the project, or even as a developer, would you rather have 10 features that kind of worked, might work sometimes if it's not raining and the sun is shining and you're doing that kind of cheat code on Super Nintendo Street Fighter where you have to get your fingers in a weird shape? Or would you rather have 6 features that definitely work every time, no matter what happens? Apply that to online banking. Apply it to your car. Maybe apply it to a plane. You get the idea, but software is running on all these platforms and all these devices. And I think it's really important that we celebrate quality and show that quality is important. There are so many tools like Cypress and Playwright. I personally like Playwright. I've gone through a variety of them. Back in the day, I started off with WebDriver and Protractor and Selenium, and then moved over to Cypress, and now I really like Playwright. I think it has lots of helper tools like inspectors and test generations, which is really great to get started. Also great for debugging when a test does fail, and it will fail on CI. It will work locally, but running on CI is this independent platform, and that's super important. But your test one day will fail. And back in the day, we used to be happy when we used to get kind of a screenshot. And then with tools like Cypress, it might have changed now, but when I was using it, you got a video and you'd see what was being clicked in the browser and it would fail because it runs the tests as a user would through the browser. But still, that was hard to debug sometimes because the button wouldn't work and you couldn't understand what was going on from the video. But with Playwright, you actually get the browser at each state. So you can actually go in and inspect the browser as you would if you were developing locally. So that is pretty awesome to go and debug when it happens. I mean, what else can we do with automated testing? Well, you could see the database. So for your development environment locally, you can check that it works and it's got access to the database and all these sorts of things, and you can see the data. So you've got data locally. You don't have to try and invent some data. That's really useful. There are accessibility checks that we can do. There are plugins for security checks, performance. Are pages taking longer to load as time goes on? Are they larger page file sizes? Like if someone included like a really big image on the page. These are things that you're able to spot with these graphs and seeing how your project performs over time. So what does a test actually look like? If they're so amazing, they must be really difficult and complicated. Well, it's just a function. I mean, you've seen this before. You've got a function. We give it a title. We then have a go-to. So we want to go to the root of the project in this example. And then you have a locator. So you locate that you want to pull something out of the page, or you could fill in the form, or you could submit a form. We click a button. And then you want to check that after the action, is the result correct? Have you gone to a new page if you've created a new entry? Does it appear in the list? Is the new title showing? There are those sorts of checks, and this is repeated over and over again. So once you've kind of written one test, you've written them all, really. And there are cool things like FixMe. So if you haven't got time to write a test, that's a lie. Let me correct that. You always have time to write a test. Just reduce the features. Let me rephrase that. Let me say, if you are doing some work in an area of the code and you notice a test is missing somewhere else, well, you can put a FixMe test in. And that's really, really useful, because when you notice that and you don't want to include that in your pull request, then you could put in a FixMe and put in the comments to replicate and reproduce the steps that the test should do. And later on, someone can come and fill that in, because when you run the test, it will say 10 passed, 2 failed, and 5 are fix me. So you know that 5 needs to be fixed, and we should stay on top of those. They shouldn't grow too much. I have seen some scary projects. I won't mention any names, but they say we've got good code coverage and we've got 5,000 tests. Watch, you can run it. And you run the 5,000 tests and it takes about 5 seconds to run, where I'm expecting it to take about 5 minutes. And that's because all the tests are marked as fix me. That is false, sense of security. Don't do that. That is really scary. And that's a great way you can contribute to open source projects, is see how many fix me tests they've got, and you can go and add these improvements. And trust me, the project will love you for it. With tools like Playwright and Cypress, you can easily mock out client-side API requests. I don't like doing that because I don't feel it's a real end-to-end test, but I appreciate sometimes for boundary conditions that is something that you want to do. With server-side components now becoming more and more popular, mocking these out doesn't make sense because they're running on the server side, so it's less useful anyway. But with server-side API requests to third parties, it's actually quite difficult to mock those out. Well, we think it is until you know how to do it, and it's actually really, really straightforward. So I know what some of you may be thinking, well, if I'm using a library like, for example, OctoKit to query GitHub's API, you could use fetch in Node, or you could use the library OctoKit. They'll eventually make the same request to GitHub's API. You'll be probably thinking, well, if you try to do this, you will know that OctoKit has a mocking kind of adapter that you could plug in. But for every different library or SDK that we use, we're not going to use a different way to mock things, and then our production code has got all these different changes scattered everywhere, and it becomes an unmanageable mess, and that's something you do not want to do. What if we could mock out every server-side request in a standard way? I love using the mswjs library, a bit of a mouthful, because it allows us to intercept both REST and GraphQL APIs, regardless of how they were made, via an SDK or via fetch or any other library that you're using. But why would we want to do that? Well, we've mentioned automated testing, and we've mentioned boundary conditions and larger data if you want to test pagination, or no data if you don't want anything to come back. What about local development? I mean, it's really good to actually have a bit more control over the data being returned from third-party APIs. Also, maybe we have no internet, or maybe that third-party API has got a rate limit and you don't want to hit it. Like, for example, if you're not authenticated, GitHub limits you to 60 requests an hour. And in development, you will go through that so fast. So you could just grab that JSON and mock it out. Also, what if you're using a paid service and your CI is also running these tests? So if you have, 500 tests and you're running them locally a few times a day, and then CI is running them multiple times because you've got a team of 5-10 people, then you're probably making 10, 50, 100,000 requests to that third-party API, and that could make a big cost. So there are so many benefits to mocking it out. Well, how do you get started? Well, you do the usual npm install mswjs, and I know what you're thinking, oh my God, it's going to be quite hard to do. But just like the test, it's actually pretty straightforward. And what can you do with this? Well, I'm using the OctoKit as an example here. And like I said, you could use fetch or any other library. At the end of the day, it's making an API REST request to GitHub's API. And here I'm mocking out the GET request, and I'm returning a response. And the response, the JSON response, I just visited that URL and grabbed that response and saved it to a local file. And then you can change that and make more files and so forth. Or you could make it into a function, and you could try and manipulate it a bit further if you wanted more control. But with mswjs, you can not only intercept that URL and come back with a response, you can have wildcards on the URL, you can change the headers. There's so much you can do. I'll let you read the docs for that. It's not a deep dive into that, but if that's something you'd like to see, do let me know in the comments below. And this can be applied to any library or framework that you're using, if you're using Express or Next.js. But I'm using Next.js, so that's what I'll give you a demo in. So after a lot of research of how I can integrate mswjs into Next.js, I heard the best way to do it is to use the instrumentation file. You do need to enable this, as it is an experimental feature. As you can see, it is just kind of one-line config to enable it. But what is this magic instrumentation.js TS file in the root of the source folder of your project. Well, this is what they say in the documentation. The instrumentation file is used to integrate observability tools into your application, allowing you to track the performance and behavior and to debug issues in production. So what do? Well, this is what the instrumentation file looks like. You export a function called register and you put it in the root of your source directory. And then this is where we're going to call the mock server and listen. And we're just going to check that it's in the Node.js environment. You can add all sorts of various logging. So if things aren't intercepted, so you've missed an intercept, it logs it for you. And you can hide some of these if it gets too noisy. There's lots of things that you can do. But this is not for production. So I know what you're thinking. We need to do an extra condition. Well, after more research, I found out that the env environment variable is a popular one. So when it equals tests, then you run the mock server. So in production, this wouldn't be set, and therefore it wouldn't run this code. But locally, we could enable it, or running the tests, we could enable it as an environment variable, and that way it would mock everything out, which is super cool in development as well as automated testing. Try it and let me know what you think. So what else can we mock? Well, I love using OAuth. I use it in all my apps, GitHub, LinkedIn, etc. I don't have to worry about managing passwords and salts and those sorts of things and reset and forgotten passwords. So I really, really love using it. Examples are, like I said, GitHub, GitLab, LinkedIn. There's so many OAuth providers, Twitter, Facebook, etc. But OAuth has been a stumbling block for automated testing. And I've seen people do all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and even making test accounts on these platforms so they can run their automated tests. Those test accounts do have access to those repos, those GitHub organizations, and that actually can be quite scary. Or later on, more gets added to those test accounts and username and passwords are shared or even committed into the project. So I recommend you mocking out those requests, and I actually thought it would be quite scary, but the only thing you really need to do is mock out two requests, the access token, and you can get the JSON response from GitHub documentation, and then the return of the user as well. And again, you can get that from GitHub documentation, or you can visit your user and just save that JSON locally, and then you can change it how you want. One other thing you will need to do is just change back that callback URL. So when you are logging in for real, your app thinks it's going to GitHub, but it's not. It's as if it came back from GitHub and GitHub said, yes, that person is who they say they are, please carry on. And so your project will think it got the okay from GitHub. So you're not kind of cheating your app in any way. You are doing a proper end-to-end test within reason, which I think is super, super awesome. It thinks it is real. So you can find any weird and wonderful things. If any cookies are being set or not set or sessions, etc., it will be real. So you have less surprises in production. So it's not that difficult to mock out OAuth, and we can be any user we want. In the open source health check project, we're Mona, because that's the example they give in the GitHub documentation. So I thought, why not? So you kind of click login and it makes you log in as Mona, no username and password required, and you can use the app. It's actually really awesome. So if you do want to see it in production, then do go check out the health check project. You can see it there in production in a real world project, and let me know your thoughts. I'm sure there are some improvements to be made, and that's where your fresh pair of eyes and perspectives and your experience comes in. So do let us know. We still might need to test things manually. We might need real data. I see people copying production locally, and that's really scary, and a whole sorts of security issues that I don't want to get into. So where is the best place to test things if you need production data? Well, production. I know it's been a joke for years, testing in production, ha ha ha. It's true, it's something we've joked about all the time. But with modern practices like feature flags, it's becoming more and more popular and safe to do so. This is my open source project, the health check that I mentioned before. As you can see on the left, there are no graphs because it's hidden. It's there, not there, but it is deployed. And I tested this locally, but I only had very limited data locally. But you can see on the right, on production again, for my user, I've actually got graphs, and I can actually see some problems with the graphs. They're looking a bit small. It's in the wrong order. Now I've got a lot more data. So it is important to test in production. But I use the open source project Flagsmith to help me do this. So I wrap those graphs in a feature flag, and then from the Flagsmith dashboard, I can enable it for all maintainers or just my specific users. So you can have segments for like admin or maintainers, and you have identities for a specific user. And I just selected my user to test this because I was a bit unsure if it was going to work. And if it did break, it'd only break for my user. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Automated testing is important. Manual testing is also required, and testing in production is also required as well, no matter how much we've joked about it over the years, and probably will continue joking about it. If you want to see the open source project Flagsmith in use in a real world project, again, health check, we're using it in there. You can go check it out. So now that you're testing and mocking fans, well, what is next? Do you need 100% code coverage? I don't think so. And I don't even think that's the best metric. But let's be honest, it is kind of the only metric that we've got. As long as it's not going down, I think that's a good thing, going up in the right direction. A bit like with GitHub repo stars. The stars on the repo aren't the best metric, but it is the one we have and it is the one we use. Say with NPM downloads, again, we look at that metric. It's not the best metric, but we do use it. It's a metric nonetheless. This wasn't a talk on unit testing versus end-to-end testing, but I do believe if you can only do one style of testing, ETE is the best way to go. You're testing it as a user. As you can see from this example, this lock works as a unit. It's for itself, the lock locks. But in the real world, in end-to-end testing, for the user, the door doesn't lock. There are so many examples of this, and this is why I think end-to-end testing as the user is super important. Tests will keep the quality high and will help you go faster. You might go slightly slower at the beginning, but then you will get faster and faster and faster. That's why most projects get slower and slower and slower, because they haven't got automated testing. Don't forget to mock out third-party API requests. You don't hit the rate limits, and you can also test boundary conditions, and you can do this with a few lines of code. For those of you who didn't comment below saying you regularly wrote automated tests, are you going to write automated tests regularly now? Let me know below. I'm curious to know your thoughts after this video. Come and geek out with me on the open source project, the open source health check. All these open source tools we're using are on this project, and it's great to geek out with you and learn from you and collaborate with you. So I will see you there, and link in the description below. See you there.